like to firstly welcome Lisa Moore. She leads the research and advocacy initiatives at the Women's Foundation, which is where Fiona Knott, who spoke in the last session, is the CEO. She's previously been a teaching and research fellow at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and has worked and volunteered for various civil society organizations in mainland China. So please, if you could welcome Lisa Moore.
Thanks for the introduction, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to be moderating this afternoon's panel. So on my far left, we have Dr. Amar Doik. He is the Director General of the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine. He is also a lawyer and a professor of public policy and public administration at Birdseye University. He holds a PhD in social policy and management from Brandeis and a master's in law and government from American University. He has a very long and diverse experience in human rights, elections management, and access to justice. Now, next to him, we have Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher. And she was appointed President of the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2017 after over 7 years as President of the Australian Law Reform Commission. She has been acknowledged in numerous ways, including as one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence. She's been awarded the Australian Women Lawyers Award. She was made a member of the Order of Australia. Macquarie University is the one who conferred her the title of Emeritus Professor, and just this year, UNSW conferred on her an honorary LLD. And last but certainly not least, we have Fern Nai, and she is CEO of Community Business, which is a Hong Kong-based not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing responsible and inclusive business practices across Asia. They have 15 years of experience in harnessing the power of business to drive social change. They've established a reputation as a thought leader and trusted partner in corporate social responsibility and diversity inclusion. They do research, they facilitate networks and events, lead campaigns, and provide training and consultancy services, so there's not much that they don't do. So as we have such diverse representation on this panel, before we dive into the topic of women and work, I want to take a step back, and I'd like to have our speakers update the audience a high-level overview of the status of women in your respective country or economy. So what are the priorities for the women's agenda? In particular, what are some of the bright spots? And what are areas that need more focused attention? So Amar, perhaps we can begin with you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's my great pleasure to be with you today. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event for having me, although I believe I come from the furthest country to your west, because there is no western to us, any Asian country. Africa starts after to our west, so I'm very grateful. Just right to the topic about women's status in Palestine. I can summarize it that we have 3 structural factors that impede women enjoyment of their full rights. And these structures, actually sometimes they work together against women's rights. These structures, I will start with the social structure. We have a conservative social structure, conservative values that have stereotypes about women's role, that women should be, at least many people believe that the best place for women is to work at home, to be a housewife. And also the social values, sometimes they condone and tolerate some kinds of violence within the family, and accept polygamy and child marriage. This is the first layer that faces women. The second layer is the formal structure, the government policies, laws. And these policies and laws, unfortunately, many of them are discriminatory against women. Discrimination against women is enshrined in many laws, particularly in family law, in retirement law, in labor law. And some of the laws applicable in Palestine, they go back to the Ottoman period. Every foreign government or every foreign power that ruled over Palestine, they left a heritage of laws that many of them are against not only women, but against the interest of the public in general. So, for example, we have the 1960 Penal Code. It's a Jordanian law applicable in the West Bank. The Family Law of 1976, it's a Jordanian law. And we have some British and Ottoman laws like Civil Code. The Penal Code allows or tolerates what is called honor killing. If somebody kills his sister or his wife on the pretext of protecting the honor of the family, the court might commute the sentence to very mitigated sentence, like a few months in prison. And then we have the third layer, and before that, even the formal layer sometimes also enforces, or most cases reinforces, the social structure. For example, the curriculum, school curriculum, in many respects, reinforces the stereotypical view of women. For example, there is a famous line in the first grade Arabic language book. It says, "My father works, my mother cooks." So it's like reinforcing the stereotypical view of women to be confined to the house. The third layer, and this is maybe the first two layers, is very common to many Arab states in the region. But the third layer is very similar maybe to Afghanistan, is the colonial structure. We are under occupation since 1976, and we have been in conflict since the beginning of the 20th century. And women are disproportionately paying price for this ongoing conflict and for the ongoing military occupation of Palestine. Women are direct victims of occupation. Many of them are in prison. As we speak now, there are over 150 women in Israeli prisons, and some of them is a famous parliamentarian and human rights defender. And many of them are children, female children. While if you look at Palestinian women in Palestinian prisons for criminal charges, they are only 40. And also they are indirect victims of violation because they bear responsibility for the families if the father is arrested or killed or if their house is demolished. And they also face lots of restriction on their movement because of the occupation. I want, if you allow me, to give an example that illustrates how these three structures in many instances work against women. In Palestine, polygamy is allowed in the law. The percentage of polygamy is less than 2% overall. But there's a particular community in the Jordan Valley. It's a remote area. It's underdeveloped area. The percentage is 40%. So that captured the attention of Birzeit University, where I work. The Women's Center at Birzeit University conducted a research on why the polygamy rates is so high in that particular region. So they found out that in that region, Israeli settlements, and Israeli settlements per se is a human rights violation because an occupying power should not move its population into the occupied territories. So there are many Israeli settlements in that area, and they have industrial zones inside the settlements. And because of Israeli security measures, Palestinian males are not allowed to enter settlements. So only females are allowed to go inside the settlements and work. So many Palestinian female, because there's no job opportunities for both genders, they go to work inside these settlements. And men, they stay at home. While they work inside settlements, the law that applies to Palestinian female workers is different from the law that applies to Israeli workers because the colonial structure. And in many cases, they are subject to abuse, subject to sexual harassment, and they do not enjoy the legal protection of Israeli courts. So when they go back home, because they breadwinners, and there's an economic incentive to marry a woman, and it's against the theory that says economic empowerment works for the advantage of women. In this particular area, economic empowerment worked to the disadvantage of women. So it became economic incentive for men to marry more than one woman. And that explains the high rate of polygamy, and that shows you how the colonial structure, the legal structure, and societal structure all together work against women. However, I want to highlight the positive points. In 2014, the State of Palestine, although we are under occupation, we joined the core international human rights treaties without any reservation, including CEDAW. And since then, there are lots of work on changing the legal framework, the outdated legal framework, and replacing them by modern legal laws that are consistent with CEDAW. For example, in the Women's Day of 2018, on 8th of March, the Prime Minister announced the amendment of the Penal Code to abolish that article that tolerate honor killing. And many other articles. For example, there's an article that if somebody rapes a woman and he gets married to her, he will be released from punishment. This article was also amended from the 1960 law. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a powerful example, and there's a lot of issues that we need to unpack, hopefully in later questions in this discussion. Rosalind, if I could turn to you to tell us a bit about what's going on in Australia briefly.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we have limited time.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go through lots of details, other than to say this, that Australia has formal equality in many respects across the whole range of legal measures that have been raised in the various presentations. And I was profoundly moved, Dr. Amar, by your revelations to us. So my tale is a different one, but it picks up a number of the themes that were raised in some of the slides before. And I thought, if I may, rather than just go through the detail of Australian formal equality, I would seize on what I think is one of the key problems that I would describe is the practical inequality. And if I can be as bold as to say this, it's the elephant in the room, the thing that no one wants to point to. The elephant in the room is childcare and elder care.
Yes.
Because the burden of childcare and elder care often is wrapped up together. I was intrigued by one of the last slides which pointed to the decline in labour participation of women in Hong Kong. Guess what age group it drops off at? Women in their 50s and 60s. Why? Because they are the ones with grandchildren or with elderly parents, and if there is not state commitment to providing care, then it falls on unpaid carers who in the main, probably in this place, certainly in Australia, the majority of unpaid carers, whether of children, people with disability, or of elders, falls on women. And that, to me, is the practical issue that unless we as people who are committed to equality that really embrace the fundamentals of Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the principles behind the various the conventions which talk about women, but it's not only about women. This is about a state's commitment to its citizens in order to provide practical equality. So unless we grasp the elephant, can you grasp an elephant? Maybe we can for the purposes of this conversation, unless we see the elephants and provide the solutions to those issues, unless we provide accessible, affordable care of a really good quality for our children, and it's our children, our people with disability, and our elders, then none of the stats are going to change. So I will just leave it at that.
I'm conscious it's sort of the end of the day, and you've all been here for the whole afternoon. And I'm also conscious of the time limitation, because Lisa gave us 2 minutes to respond to this question. And Asia is massive. There's lots and lots. If you want to talk about gender issues across Asia, you could be here all night. But I will focus on women's issues in the workplace. And that's sort of our thing. So the good news across Asia is there's a lot going on in terms of gender diversity in the workplace. It's always been a key priority for many companies, especially multinationals. And with the Me Too movement, the He for She campaign, and also the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality, gender is still on the agenda. We know from working with companies, and we do that mainly through our regional diversity and inclusion in Asia network, which comprises 50 multinationals, that increasing the representation of women at senior levels continues to be a huge challenge. We know that we actually track the status of women on boards in Hong Kong, and we also know what's happening in other markets, that it's a pretty gloomy picture when you talk about the board level. And despite all the evidence, the growing evidence base that women on boards or gender diversity on boards contributes to better business results or impacts the bottom line, we still have a lot of, stagnation on this issue. We're doing a diversity and inclusion benchmark in India this year, and early results are that, the good thing is that companies are complying with the law in terms of having at least one woman on their executive committees or their boards. Sometimes I think it's just ticking the box. But a very low percentage, under 12%, have at least 30% women at senior levels. So this is quite, it's difficult to understand. When it comes to gender diversity, there's a number of priority topics that many companies are dealing with. Addressing issues related to sexual harassment. We talked about that earlier in the wake of the Me Too movement. Many companies are reviewing their policies, guidelines, practices, and introducing training for staff. And I remember when I was in corporate many, many years ago, probably 30 years ago, there was training. But the training now is completely different because it is really a different era. In India, companies are placing a huge emphasis on safety for their female workers, even helping them get to and from work. Just very basic things that you wouldn't think necessary in places like Hong Kong. Another hot topic is gender pay gap reporting. There are regulatory requirements in some markets like the UK and Iceland around where they're actually legislating against gender pay gap. It hasn't come to Asia yet, but some companies are being proactive around it, starting to look at their workforce data and trying to understand where they might have gender pay gap, and then taking steps to address those. But really, some companies are quite fearful of doing it to see and seeing where really the issues are. But I think some of this work, it's really important. But it probably reinforces what we already know, that there are biases in the system, and a lot of work needs to be done to understand where the biases are and to mitigate them. Many companies are providing the enabling environment for women to advance through flexible work arrangements, return to work programs, women's networks, etc. What we find is what works in some markets doesn't work in others, so you can't really take sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. You really do need to talk to your employees, the women in your market, and try to bring in initiatives that address their needs. And engaging men continues to be an important topic. So Fiona talked about this in the last session. And so I just wanted to highlight a few bright spots in Asia. So the last World Economic Forum 2017 Global Gender Gap Report, which tracks the gender gap in 144 markets around the world, and it looks at the gap between men and women in terms of educational attainment, health and survival, economic opportunities, and political empowerment. So would anybody like to hazard a guess as to which Asian market has done the best? Anybody? Just guess. It's not Hong Kong. Sadly, it's not Hong Kong. But I think Hong Kong is lumped with China. No, definitely it's not Singapore. It is the Philippines. Number 10 out of 144, which is a huge achievement. When you go down that list of Asian countries, 53 is Mongolia, 64 Laos, 65 Singapore, 69 Vietnam, 75 Thailand. So the Asian markets aren't doing very well. But I think what Philippines, and I'm sure there are Philippines friends here probably enlightened what is going right, but Philippines tends to be quite a matriarchal society. Women are very educated. I think companies recognize the value of women and have flexible working arrangements and other things that support the advancement of women. And I think now Philippines is increasing its statutory maternity leave from 60 days. In fact, that's very low. I think it's probably the lowest of many, many countries, 60 days statutory maternity leave, and it's being increased to, is it 100 or 120 days? But so that's just coming into law now. So despite that, the Philippines has done very, very well.
Yeah.
And then just very, very quickly, China has been, it maybe because of the economic boom in China, it's been a ripe environment for women to succeed, especially entrepreneurs. And I read a report from last year saying that of the 88 self-made female billionaires, if that's your measure of success, around the world, 56 of those are from China, 56 Chinese business women. So 2/3 of that list. And probably with Chinese society, the support, family support, also maybe the one-child policy has helped women, but that's changing. And yeah, so maybe I'll just stop at that. But yeah, there's definitely a lot that's going on.
Very, very long list. Thank you, Fern. Amar, I actually wanted to turn to you because you mentioned that there are no sex anti-discrimination laws in Palestine in the private sector. And this places, a disproportionate amount of power with the employers. So can you tell us about, what are some of the key barriers to introducing this type of legislation? And in the absence of that, do you have any other institutions or organizations, either locally or internationally, that are, filling in this gap and providing support in its absence?
Well, first let me give some numbers. Women participation in the labor market is around 19%. If you add the informal sector, which is predominantly women, it goes up to 25%. Still low, but if you compare it to other Arab countries, it's much better. Like, for example, in Jordan, it's 14%. In Yemen, it's 5%, or even less than 5%. Saudi Arabia, now with progressive new policies, women participation is increasing, but still less than 10%. So women participation in the labor market is increasing, although we have seen in the last 2 years a decrease in women participation. It used to be 20, now it's 19 point something. We see a migration of women back to home, from labor market to home, and one of the reasons for that is some barriers. For example, there's no equal pay for equal job. Women do not enjoy the allowances that are given, for example, if you have children, or if you are married. Women, they do not get these allowances. It's only for men. This is both in the public and private sector. Also, the pension package for women is less than the pension package for men. That applies both to the public and private sector. Women are discriminated against in the law, in the pension law. That, as I mentioned, gives different pension package. But in the labor market, we have two types of labor market. We have the formal organized labor market and the informal. The formal organized labor market, they apply the labor market, the labor law of 2000, Palestinian law, and the law does not really set forth detailed framework for against discrimination. Actually, the term discrimination or gender-based discrimination is not defined in the Palestinian law. And the CEDAW recommendation that came out last month, after the State of Palestine submitted the report to the CEDAW committee, they asked the government to put in the Palestinian law a comprehensive definition of discrimination, because it's not, there's no definition for discrimination. So women in the formal labor market, in the organized labor market, they do not have a legal framework to provide protection for them against discrimination. While if you go to the informal labor market, and which is it's getting bigger because of the erosion in the rule of law and the decline in the power of the government because of the occupation. Informal sector is dominated by women, and there's no protection for them. They don't get contracts, they don't get the minimum wage, they don't get the benefits of the labor law like vacations, unpaid leave, and so forth. So this is a challenge. What are organizations in place to remedy for that? Well, first we have, despite the bleak situation, we have a very vibrant, active civil society in Palestine, and it's the most maybe organized civil society in the Arab region. And women groups are very active and organized in Palestine, and they're advocating for lots of changes in the law, including the package that I mentioned that was introduced on the Women's Day in March 2018. Second, we have a Ministry of Women's Affairs, and there's a Minister of Women's Affairs. And this ministry, although they don't get really enough budget from the government, they are doing a great job in terms of advancing certain policies and providing protection to women in certain sectors that are usually not protected. And third, we now after our joining the CEDAW Convention without reservation, we find this a great opportunity for us as working in the human rights field, that there is a framework and reference for us to push for certain reforms. And now after CEDAW published its recommendations to the State of Palestine last month, we find it as a roadmap for us to push for reform and to hold the government accountable for certain required reforms.
Rosalind, if I can turn to you, I want to come back to your idea of caregiving, and I want to talk specifically about discrimination in that respect. And women's roles as mothers often is seen as negatively competing with their role as an employee. And this is particularly true for pregnant or newly returned mothers. So if you can tell us, how prevalent are complaints around pregnancy and family status discrimination, or are you seeing, other trends around breastfeeding complaints? What is going on where you are?
Yes, thank you. We do have those as grounds under our sex discrimination legislation. So breastfeeding is a protected attribute now under our sex discrimination legislation. But in terms of our overall complaints, they predominantly are complaints about employment. But in fact, the majority of our complaints are about disability discrimination in employment. The sexual discrimination in employment and sexual harassment is next, but by far and away our majority of complaints are about disability. And I think that's, while we do get some, there has been considerable progress in relation to things like breastfeeding, pregnancy discrimination, and so on. And because of the increased awareness and I think the great work that bodies like the Human Rights Commission and the state commissions do about lifting awareness and understanding amongst employers, complaints when they do arise, by and large, can be conciliated quite successfully. Okay. So there was one I remember where a student was studying something like physiotherapy. So she was going to have to do physical manipulation. And the university said, well, when you're very pregnant, we don't think you can do that. So they were making a judgment about her abilities because of her pregnancy, which of course is a rather paternalistic and not evidence-based conclusion. And a pregnancy can be very empowering. I can say that from personal experience. But what the conciliation process did was to introduce a greater awareness, and rather than judging the matter, the way it was resolved was to say, well, look, if you can provide a medical certificate that attests to your abilities in these circumstances, then that covers us from our point of view of our responsibility to you as our student, but also enables you to take responsibility and provide us what we need as well. So they were able to resolve it that way. So there was a good outcome in terms of awareness about prejudging things about people's abilities, which actually links into our overall theme about dignity and not prejudging things for someone else. And also the ability for conciliation processes to achieve systemic outcomes, which is a really good thing.
Very good. Fern, can you give us perhaps one or two examples from companies that are doing very good things around supporting employees with caregiving responsibilities?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think the whole sort of topic is beyond just childcare and family care. It's elder care, which is going to be more and more prevalent as our population ages, and this is across the board in many different markets. I read something quite interesting recently that women, of course, who do bear more of the caregiving responsibilities, every time a woman has a child, there's a penalty. It's like in terms of bias, but also reward in terms of salary. Whereas men, if his family grows and his partner has a baby, he actually gets rewarded because he's seen as more stable, more responsible. So there's a positive bias towards men when their family grows, and the opposite, which is actually quite sad. So recently, I was talking to one company, and talking about things that change the paradigm. There's, I think, more and more women and men would like to work on a part-time basis or work on a freelance basis. And typically, the traditional, conventional thinking is, if you're in a company and you're working part-time, you're not going to advance in your career because you're not committed or, whatever. But one law firm that we work with, they're actually ensuring that those people that are working part-time still, are having careers. They may never go back to full-time, but they're still on the career track and they're still looked at as talent. And also they're being promoted as well. So I think that's quite a paradigm-busting concept. I think companies really should, talk to their employees. I mean, as I said before, one size doesn't fit all. Women have different experiences. We talk about intersectionality. Somebody who is in a different job or a different industry might have completely different needs. So I think there's a lot of you expect now that flexibility is there. You expect maybe return to work programs, but some companies are doing coaching not of the employee that might be going on maternity leave, but her line manager, in terms of like managing that transition. And it's not just about the woman. There are things that people are doing to provide more support for women and men that are going through these changes. Yeah. And really, it is about engaging and retaining staff.
Absolutely.
Because these are, life-changing or transitional milestones where if you don't do things right and create that inclusive environment, you might lose the employee. You hear of so many women who go on maternity leave, and then they think, well, are they going to even come back? Or they might come back for a period and decide to, maybe the role they have is not conducive, or the environment is not conducive when they have a small child to look after.